What if the advice to always eat breakfast, something you've likely heard repeated your entire life as an unquestionable rule of healthy living, actually works differently inside a body that's 50 or older than the general population studies it was often based on? At the same time, what if the opposite trend, the growing popularity of skipping breakfast entirely as part of intermittent fasting, carries its own specific considerations for adults over 50 that rarely get discussed alongside the enthusiastic testimonials online? Both of these positions get repeated with a lot of confidence, and both deserve a more honest, nuanced look specifically for this stage of life. So today we're going to walk through exactly what happens inside your body when you skip breakfast after 50, the genuine benefits some people experience, the specific risks and considerations that matter more at this age than they did in your 30s, and how to figure out whether skipping breakfast is a reasonable choice for your particular situation. Before we begin, remember this video is for education only. If you have diabetes, a history of disordered eating, take medication that requires food, or are underweight, please speak with your doctor before making any significant changes to your eating pattern. Now let's begin. Most people ask, is it bad to skip breakfast? But that's actually the wrong framing for this conversation, because the honest research doesn't point to a single, universal answer that applies equally to everyone. The better question is, what specifically happens inside my body when I skip breakfast, given my particular age, my current health status, and my individual daily patterns, and does that specific physiological response work in my favor or against it? Because skipping breakfast triggers a genuine, measurable cascade of hormonal and metabolic changes, and whether those changes serve you well or work against you depends considerably on factors that shift meaningfully after 50. Here is why age changes this conversation so significantly. Insulin sensitivity and blood sugar regulation, discussed extensively in other conversations, naturally shift after 50, meaning the specific pattern of when and how often you eat can produce different effects than it would have in earlier decades. Muscle mass, as discussed in other conversations about age-related muscle loss, requires more deliberate protein intake to maintain after 50, and the timing and distribution of that protein intake across your day, including whether breakfast is part of that distribution, genuinely matters more than it did when your body's muscle-building processes were naturally more robust and forgiving. And many adults over 50 manage specific medications that have particular requirements around food timing, adding another layer of consideration that simply didn't apply for most people in their 20s or 30s. Think of your body's metabolism like a car that can run reasonably well on different driving patterns, but performs noticeably differently depending on which pattern you choose and what kind of engine you're working with. A newer, more efficient engine might handle stop-and-start city driving and long highway stretches with similar overall efficiency. But an older engine, one that's covered considerably more miles and whose components have naturally worn somewhat with use, might genuinely perform better with one particular driving pattern over another. Not because either pattern is inherently wrong, but because the specific demands of each pattern interact differently with an engine that's changed over time. Your metabolism after 50 works somewhat similarly, meaning the specific pattern of skipping or eating breakfast that worked well for your body decades ago may or may not continue serving you equally well now. Let's start with the first thing that happens when you skip breakfast, and it involves your blood sugar and stress hormone response directly. When you skip your first meal and extend your overnight fast further into the morning, your body relies more heavily on stored glycogen, your body's stored form of carbohydrate energy, and once that becomes somewhat depleted, your body begins releasing cortisol to help maintain adequate blood sugar levels during this extended fasting period. This is a completely normal physiological response, but it interacts directly with the natural morning cortisol surge already discussed in other conversations about mornings and blood pressure, meaning skipping breakfast essentially extends and potentially amplifies a hormonal pattern that's already naturally elevated during the morning hours. For some people, this combination produces no noticeable negative effect and may even align well with their body's natural rhythm. For others, particularly those already managing elevated cortisol from other sources, such as significant life stress or poor sleep, this additional extension can contribute to feeling more anxious, jittery, or irritable during the late morning hours, a pattern worth paying attention to as a genuinely individual response rather than assuming it will affect everyone identically. The second thing that happens involves insulin sensitivity specifically, and this is where the research genuinely gets more interesting and more relevant to the age-specific conversation. Some research on intermittent fasting patterns, including skipping breakfast as a form of time-restricted eating, has found associations with improved insulin sensitivity over time in certain populations, since extending your daily fasting window gives your body a longer stretch without incoming food to fully process and clear from your bloodstream, potentially reducing the overall demand placed on your insulin response throughout a full day. This represents a genuine, evidence-supported potential benefit for some adults over 50, particularly those managing insulin resistance or working to improve their metabolic health more broadly. However, this benefit appears considerably more pronounced when the eating window that follows is thoughtfully structured with balanced, adequate meals, rather than simply skipping breakfast and then eating in a less structured, less nutritionally complete way during the remaining hours of the day, a distinction that matters considerably for whether this particular benefit is genuinely realized. The third thing that happens involves muscle protein synthesis, the biological process responsible for maintaining and building muscle tissue, an area of particular relevance given the natural muscle loss that becomes more significant after 50, discussed extensively in other conversations. Muscle protein synthesis responds most effectively to protein intake spread relatively evenly across multiple meals throughout the day, rather than concentrated into just one or two larger meals, since your body can only effectively use so much protein for muscle building purposes at any single sitting, with additional protein beyond that threshold used less efficiently for this specific purpose. Skipping breakfast effectively compresses your total daily protein intake into fewer eating occasions, meaning if your remaining meals don't specifically compensate by including adequate protein at each occasion, your overall muscle protein synthesis throughout the day may be somewhat less effective than it would be with protein more evenly distributed across 3 meals, including breakfast. This is one of the more genuinely relevant, age-specific considerations that doesn't carry the same weight for a younger adult with naturally more robust, forgiving muscle-building processes, but becomes more meaningfully relevant after 50, when supporting muscle protein synthesis as effectively as possible carries more direct importance. The fourth thing that happens involves your energy levels and cognitive function throughout the morning specifically, an area where individual variation tends to be considerable. Some people report feeling genuinely clear-headed, focused, and energetic when skipping breakfast, particularly those who've adapted to this pattern over an extended period, since sustained fasting periods can promote a metabolic state where your body becomes more efficient at using fat stores for energy. Sometimes associated with a sense of mental clarity, some people specifically seek out through intermittent fasting practices. Others, however, experience the opposite: noticeable brain fog, irritability, difficulty concentrating, or a persistent, distracting hunger that undermines their morning productivity and mood, particularly common among people who haven't given their body adequate time to adapt to this pattern, or whose individual physiology simply doesn't respond as favorably to extended morning fasting. Neither response is inherently right or wrong, but honestly assessing which pattern genuinely describes your own experience, rather than assuming you should feel a certain way because of what you've read or heard from others, matters considerably for determining whether this eating pattern genuinely serves you well. The fifth thing that happens involves bone health, an area that connects to breakfast timing in a way many people don't initially consider. Calcium absorption and utilization benefit from being spread across the day rather than concentrated into fewer eating occasions, and breakfast often serves as a natural opportunity to include calcium-rich foods, such as dairy products or fortified alternatives, as part of a broader, balanced daily intake pattern. For adults over 50, particularly women navigating the bone density changes associated with menopause, ensuring adequate calcium intake distributed reasonably throughout the day, rather than concentrated into just 1 or 2 meals, represents a genuinely relevant consideration when deciding whether and how to restructure your eating pattern around skipping breakfast specifically. Now let's talk about the sixth thing that happens, and this one involves medication timing specifically, a consideration that becomes increasingly relevant as more adults over 50 manage one or more regular prescriptions. As discussed in other conversations about morning routines and medication, certain medications, including some thyroid medications and osteoporosis treatments, have specific timing requirements relative to food, sometimes needing to be taken on a genuinely empty stomach, sometimes needing to be taken with food to reduce stomach irritation or improve absorption. Skipping breakfast entirely can either simplify or complicate these specific medication timing requirements depending on your particular prescriptions, making this a genuinely individual consideration worth reviewing directly with your doctor or pharmacist rather than assuming any general pattern applies universally to your specific medication regimen. Now let's talk about the seventh and final consideration, and this one involves how skipping breakfast interacts with your overall daily eating pattern and total nutrient intake, rather than being considered purely in isolation. For some people, skipping breakfast simply means eating the same total daily nutrition compressed into fewer meals, which can work reasonably well if those remaining meals are thoughtfully structured to include adequate protein, fiber, and micronutrients. For others, skipping breakfast leads to genuinely reduced total daily nutrient intake, since the calories and nutrients that would have been consumed at breakfast simply aren't fully compensated for later in the day, sometimes due to reduced appetite later or simply not consciously adjusting other meals to account for the missing breakfast. This distinction between compressing your existing nutrition into fewer meals versus genuinely undereating overall matters considerably for whether skipping breakfast supports or undermines your broader health goals, particularly relevant for muscle maintenance and overall nutritional adequacy after 50. Now, before we go further, let's debunk a few common myths about breakfast and fasting specifically. For years, Many people believe that breakfast is unconditionally the most important meal of the day for every single person, based largely on general population research that didn't specifically account for age-related metabolic differences. Some believed that intermittent fasting and skipping breakfast automatically produces the same benefits for everyone, regardless of age, current health status, or how the remaining eating window is actually structured. Some believed that any hunger or discomfort experienced while adapting to a new eating pattern is simply something to push through indefinitely, rather than genuine feedback worth paying attention to. And some believed that skipping breakfast is either entirely safe or entirely harmful, without recognizing the considerable individual variation and the specific factors, medication use, muscle maintenance needs, blood sugar management, and bone health, that make this a genuinely personalized decision rather than a universal rule. But when we look at the actual research and the specific mechanisms involved, the picture becomes considerably more individualized. The real questions are not simply, is breakfast mandatory, or is fasting automatically beneficial? The better questions are, how does my own body genuinely respond in terms of energy, mood, and focus when I skip breakfast? Am I structuring my remaining meals to include adequate protein, spread reasonably throughout my eating window, to support muscle maintenance? Do any of my medications have specific timing requirements that make skipping breakfast more complicated? And am I genuinely compressing my existing nutrition into fewer meals, or am I unintentionally undereating overall as a result of skipping this particular meal? Now let's build a simple, practical framework for evaluating whether skipping breakfast is a reasonable choice for your individual situation after 50. First, honestly assess your own energy, mood, and cognitive function during the morning hours when you skip breakfast, ideally over several attempts rather than judging based on a single day, since initial adjustment periods can feel different from your longer-term adapted response. Second, if you do skip breakfast, ensure your remaining meals include adequate protein at each occasion, ideally aiming for a meaningful protein source at both lunch and dinner, to help support the muscle protein synthesis discussed earlier, rather than concentrating most of your daily protein into a single larger meal. Third, review any regular medications with your doctor or pharmacist specifically regarding their timing requirements relative to food, ensuring your chosen eating pattern doesn't inadvertently interfere with proper medication timing and effectiveness. Fourth, pay attention to your total daily nutrient intake, including calcium and other micronutrients relevant to bone health, ensuring skipping breakfast doesn't result in a meaningfully reduced overall daily intake compared to your body's actual needs. Fifth, if you're managing diabetes, prediabetes, or any other blood sugar concern, discuss intermittent fasting or breakfast skipping specifically with your doctor, since the blood sugar and insulin implications discussed today carry particular relevance and require more individualized guidance for anyone in this specific situation. Let's talk a bit more about how to actually structure an eating pattern that skips breakfast in a way that supports rather than undermines your health after 50, assuming your own individual response and medication situation make this a reasonable choice for you. This typically involves consolidating your eating into a window of roughly 8 to 10 hours, for example, eating your first meal around noon and your last meal around 8 or 9 in the evening, rather than an extremely narrow eating window that makes it genuinely difficult to consume adequate total protein and nutrients within the available time. Within that window, structuring 2 substantial, well-balanced meals, each including a genuine protein source alongside vegetables, whole grains, and healthy fats, tends to work considerably better for supporting muscle maintenance and overall nutritional adequacy than a pattern of frequent, smaller, less nutritionally complete snacking throughout a compressed eating window. It's also worth addressing what a reasonable adjustment period looks like if you're considering trying this pattern for the first time, since your body's initial response during the first week or 2 often differs meaningfully from your longer-term adapted response. Many people report more noticeable hunger, irritability, or difficulty concentrating during roughly the first 1 to 2 weeks of skipping breakfast, as their body adjusts to this new pattern, with these initial symptoms often becoming considerably more manageable or resolving entirely once this adjustment period has passed. This doesn't mean everyone eventually adapts favorably, but it does mean judging this eating pattern based solely on your very first attempt, before any adjustment period has occurred, may not accurately reflect how your body will respond once it has more time to adapt. Let's talk briefly about exercise timing specifically for anyone who both skips breakfast and prefers to work out in the morning, since this combination deserves its own particular consideration. Exercising in a fasted state, meaning before your first meal, has been associated in some research with modestly increased fat utilization during that specific exercise session, since your body has less readily available carbohydrate fuel and shifts somewhat more toward using fat stores for energy. However, for adults over 50 specifically, particularly those engaging in resistance training to address the muscle maintenance concerns discussed in other conversations, fasted exercise may feel noticeably more difficult to sustain at an adequate intensity, and some research suggests fasted resistance training may be somewhat less effective for muscle protein synthesis compared to training with some recent food intake, since your body has less readily available amino acids circulating to support the muscle repair process that begins during and immediately after resistance exercise. If muscle maintenance is a particular priority for you, and you both skip breakfast and prefer morning workouts, considering a small amount of protein, even something as simple as a few bites before training, or shifting your resistance training to align with your eating window when adequate protein has already been consumed, may offer a more favorable combination than fully fasted resistance training specifically. It's also worth briefly mentioning a less commonly discussed consideration relevant to some adults over 50, the connection between meal timing and gallbladder health. Extended fasting periods, particularly when combined with rapid or significant weight loss, have been associated in some research with an increased risk of gallstone formation, since the gallbladder empties less frequently during extended fasting, potentially allowing bile to become more concentrated over time. This risk appears most relevant for significant, rapid weight loss combined with prolonged fasting patterns, rather than a modest, well-structured breakfast skipping routine on its own, but it's worth mentioning as a genuine consideration for anyone specifically combining intermittent fasting with an aggressive weight loss goal, and worth discussing directly with your doctor if you have any personal or family history of gallstones specifically. Of several weeks and still find that it consistently produces noticeable negative effects, whether persistent fatigue, difficulty concentrating, or simply an ongoing sense that it doesn't feel right for their body. This is genuinely valuable, personal information, and there's no requirement to force an eating pattern that consistently doesn't serve you well simply because it's currently popular or because it works favorably for other people. Eating a balanced breakfast that includes adequate protein remains a perfectly reasonable, evidence-supported choice for anyone whose individual response to breakfast skipping is consistently unfavorable, and choosing to eat breakfast doesn't represent a failure to achieve some ideal, universal eating pattern, but rather a reasonable, personalized choice based on your own genuine experience. And what about people managing a history of disordered eating, who might find that structured fasting periods trigger unhealthy patterns of restriction or an unhealthy relationship with food and hunger cues? This is a genuinely important consideration, and anyone with any history of disordered eating should approach intermittent fasting or breakfast skipping with particular caution, ideally in direct conversation with their doctor or a mental health professional familiar with their specific history, since structured periods of food restriction, even when framed around general health goals, can potentially trigger or reinforce previous unhealthy patterns for some individuals, making this a situation where general population guidance genuinely doesn't apply without significant additional, individualized consideration. Let's also briefly address hydration specifically during an extended morning fasting period, since this is a genuinely relevant consideration regardless of your overall response to skipping breakfast. As discussed in other conversations about mornings, mild overnight dehydration is common upon waking, and extending your fasting period further into the morning without adequate attention to fluid intake can compound this mild dehydration, particularly if your morning coffee or tea, which carries its own mild diuretic effect discussed in other conversations, represents your primary fluid intake during this extended fasting window. Ensuring genuine water intake throughout your fasting period, separate from any caffeinated beverages, remains relevant regardless of whether you're eating breakfast or extending your fast further into the day. Now let's summarize everything in a simple way. Skipping breakfast after 50 triggers several specific physiological effects worth understanding individually, including an extension of your body's natural morning cortisol pattern, potential improvements in insulin sensitivity for some individuals when the remaining eating window is well structured, a compression of your total daily protein intake into fewer meals that can affect muscle protein synthesis if not specifically addressed, considerable individual variation in energy and cognitive function during the fasting period, relevant considerations for calcium and bone health distribution throughout the day, potential interactions with medication timing requirements, and the important distinction between compressing existing nutrition into fewer meals versus genuinely undereating overall. Whether skipping breakfast represents a beneficial or unfavorable choice for your particular situation depends considerably on your own individual response, how thoughtfully your remaining meals are structured, your current medications, and any relevant underlying health conditions, making this a genuinely personalized decision rather than a universal rule that applies identically to everyone regardless of age or individual circumstance. But remember, the goal here isn't to convince you that skipping breakfast is either something you must adopt or something you must avoid. It's to help you understand the actual mechanisms at play, so you can make a genuinely informed decision based on your own body's response, your specific health situation, and your individual medication needs, rather than following general trend-driven advice in either direction, without considering how it specifically applies to you at this particular stage of life. So if you're curious about exploring this eating pattern, or reconsidering a pattern you've already been following, start by honestly reflecting on how your body has genuinely responded during past attempts. If any, review your current medications with your doctor or pharmacist regarding timing requirements, and if you do choose to skip breakfast, focus specifically on ensuring your remaining meals include adequate, well-distributed protein to support your muscle maintenance needs at this stage of life. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you currently eat breakfast or skip it? And if you've tried both patterns, which one genuinely felt better for your energy, mood, and focus throughout the day? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may help someone else watching this video make a more informed, personalized decision about their own eating pattern. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe to Nutri, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more simple, practical health strategies for adults over 50. And next, watch our video on 5 signs you're losing muscle mass after 50 and how to stop it, because how you structure your eating pattern throughout the day connects directly to how well you're able to maintain the strength and muscle that support your independence for years to come.